This is not a story about cheating. That is the first thing you must understand. Because if it were cheating, everything would be simple. They would have caught him red-handed, stripped the titles, and everyone could have gone back to their racing. No. What Smokey Yunick did was far more subtle and dangerous than that. He didn't break the rules. He made the rules meaningless. By the late 1950s and early 60s, NASCAR was becoming a well-oiled machine. It was no longer the realm of bootleggers and souped-up cars. Now it was a business. And like any business, it needed stability. It needed bosses, and it needed rules, not just to ensure safety or fairness, but to ensure that those in power remained in power. The rules were written not to encourage innovation, but to control it. They created a box, and everyone was expected to play inside that box. Then came Smokey Yunick, a former Air Force mechanic with the squinted eyes of a gambler and the mind of a man who took things apart just to see how they worked. He didn't look at those rules and think, how do I play within these? He looked at them and wondered, where are the gaps? He decided not to compete. He decided to prove the game was rigged, and he started with the simplest thing imaginable: air. Everyone knows an engine needs three things: fuel, fire, and air. NASCAR's rules governed carburetor size, they governed fuel. But air was vague. How do you measure the volume of air coming in? How do you prove that air is cooler, denser? Smokey didn't build a new part. He just rerouted the journey. He created a long, winding, calculated system of air ducts designed to cool every cubic inch of air before it hit the combustion chamber. No rule banned a long tube. No rule said air had to travel in a straight line. The first car to run with that system didn't win. It didn't even sound particularly different. But when the inspectors opened the hood after the race, they saw those ducts. They touched them, and they went silent. It wasn't the silence of admiration. It was the silence of a question they didn't want answered. If this is legal, then what does everything we know about limiting power even mean? That inspection didn't end with a flag. It ended with a closed-door meeting. And from that moment, a war began. A war without roaring engines, just the sound of rulebook pages turning and whispers in corridors of power. What happened next was not an accident. It was a deliberate decision, and it would redefine everything. That decision didn't come from the hot asphalt of the track or a team's pit wall. It came from a quiet room where no engines ran, only the tick of a clock and the smell of old coffee. It was where the rules were drafted. And you have to understand this. Writing the rules is not simply about creating a game. It is the ultimate form of control. Every line, every specification is an invisible wall. They don't exist to prevent cheating. They exist to prevent change. NASCAR, at that point, was no longer about speed. It was becoming about control. Control of costs, control of image, control of who could win, and more importantly, who was allowed to lose. The big manufacturers were pouring money in, and they needed predictability. They needed a playing field they understood, where victory could be calculated by budget and consistency, not by an unforeseen technological leap from an independent mechanic. And then Smokey Yunick, with a mind that never stopped looking for gaps, found a gap so wide you could drive a convoy through it. Weight. The rulebook stated the car's minimum weight. It was measured post-race, with the fuel tanks empty. It said nothing about how that weight was distributed throughout the race. And so, the legendary Carmer 7 was born. Smokey installed a complex water tank system. Before weighing, a car had to be full of fuel, coolant, and oil. During the race, this water would be slowly drained, not for cooling, but to shed pounds ounce by ounce. By the race's end, the car was dozens of pounds lighter than at the start. It didn't break a rule. It just exploited a loophole in the language. The problem wasn't how much more powerful the car was. The problem was how easily it became more powerful, through a trick no one had thought of. The chain reaction was immediate. The rival teams weren't angry. First, they were astonished, then afraid. Because if this was allowed, the entire foundation of fairness they operated on would crumble. They began to apply pressure. Phone calls were made. Unofficial complaints were lodged. And NASCAR's officials, instead of making a public statement, chose silence. No press release. No explanation. Just closed-door meetings where men in suits looked at each other and understood they faced an existential threat. A player who refused to play by the unwritten rules. Smokey Yunick now began to realize the bitter truth. This was no longer a race. Not in the way he understood. It was a political chess match. Winning was no longer the sole goal, not even the primary one. Now it was replaced by something more primal: survival. Survival of the idea, survival of a career, survival of the very sport as he knew it. And from within that silence, a signal was sent. They didn't change the rules immediately. They didn't ban his system specifically. They waited. An intentional heavy wait, like a blade held in suspense. Because they knew, with a man like Smokey, banning one thing just made him think of two others. The only way to beat an outlier was to change the entire playing field. The ban wasn't announced on the racetrack amid engine roars and the smell of burning rubber. It arrived on paper, an internal memo, a minor amendment in the thick rulebook, effective the following season. It was cold, clinical, and deliberately precise. Its weight lay in the silence it carried, the termination of a debate that had never officially taken place. The reason given was safety. It always is. They said the water tank system could rupture, cause a hazard. They said the complex air ducts could be a fire risk. Those were the words they used. But what they meant was control. Safety was the perfect shield. Who could argue with it? It made any protest seem selfish, reckless. It was a masterful political stroke. And then came the moment of betrayal. It didn't come from an enemy, but from supposed allies. The big manufacturers, who had whispered support for Smokey's innovations in the shadows, now went silent. They withdrew. Because they realized a public fight with NASCAR over an independent mechanic wasn't worth the risk. They needed NASCAR stable more than they needed a revolutionary victory. Smokey watched the support evaporate like smoke. He didn't fail because an engine blew. He failed because the very pillars he thought he could lean on were pulled away. The consequence was immediate and total. The car number 7 project was scrapped, not just discontinued. It was dismantled. Its unique parts were stripped, some thrown away, others vanished into dark storage. The car didn't retire. It was erased, as if it had never existed. The people in his crew scattered. Smokey himself was pushed to the edge of the spotlight, becoming a controversial figure mainstream teams were wary to associate with. But its legacy could not be erased. The banned technology didn't die. The ideas about cooling intake air, about managing weight dynamically, all seeped into the engineering consciousness. They resurfaced years later in other forms, under other rulebooks. They could ban a specific design, but they couldn't ban the idea that the rules could be read differently. They couldn't delete the question that had been planted. If not for safety, then for what? The sport moved on. New seasons, new stars, new rivalries. But on the day they chose to extinguish Car 7 with a rule amendment, something was lost. It was the naive belief that the racetrack was a pure laboratory, where the best idea, not the best power system, would win. A piece of the wildness, of the innocent exploration, had been cut out. And that cut, while healed, left a scar that those who know where to look can always see. And then, everything returned to normal. That's the strangest part. The next season happened. New cars appeared on track with new liveries and new sponsors. Newspaper headlines moved on to other stories of close finishes, of new feuds. The races went on. The entertainment machine's wheels didn't slow. The normalcy descended, thick and complete like a fresh coat of paint over a crack. Smokey Yunick wasn't fired. There was no ceremony, no termination letter. He simply stopped being invited. Calls from top-tier teams grew less frequent. Consulting contracts weren't renewed. He became a legend in small garages, in stories told after hours, but a discomforting name in shiny executive offices. They didn't need to remove him. They just needed to make him invisible. And official history began its work of rewriting. In NASCAR history books, in anniversary articles, the story of car number 7 and its tricks was omitted or reduced to an amusing anecdote. Oh, that crazy Smokey guy? He used to do weird stuff. It was stripped of its seriousness, the threat it once represented. Official history prefers clean, clear-cut victories, stories of bravery and skill. This story, it wasn't clean. It was full of gray areas, questions of ethics, and of a system having to change its own rules to protect itself. And so, it was sidelined. But traces remained. A few old photographs taken surreptitiously in the garage, a few technical drawings kept like treasures by his former apprentices. And the car, or what was left of it, still exists. It sits in a private warehouse, not on display, not curated, just a metal skeleton gathering dust. It's still there, just not where people can see it. So we stand here decades later, looking back. The final question isn't about engineering. It's quieter, but cuts deeper. Was it too dangerous? Or was it just too inconvenient? Too inconvenient for a system that needed stability more than it needed a revolution? The answer you choose will tell not just what you think of Smokey Yunick, but what you believe truly drives this world, pure ideas, or the power structures designed to contain them. Today, most people don't even remember its name. Smokey's number 7 car. It sounds like an urban legend, a story old-timers tell by the fire. It has faded with time, blurred into the countless other lore of NASCAR. The distance of years has softened the sharp edges, turned a potential scandal into a curious anecdote. But we must call it by its proper name. Let's re-identify this story one last time. It wasn't banned because it failed. It wasn't removed because it didn't work. On the contrary, it was taken out precisely because it did work. It worked too well. It proved that the walls of the rulebook box could be bent, even warped, without being broken. And for a system built on the belief that box was inviolable, that was an existential threat. And then place it into the larger flow of history. Look beyond one car or one season. The ideas that were suppressed then didn't die. They migrated. They shape-shifted. You can see their fingerprints in today's regulations. The rules about sealed engines, about rigorous pre- and post-race inspection procedures, about banning any movable system that could alter weight, they all carry the DNA of that encounter. NASCAR and professional motorsport as a whole learned its lesson. You must write rules not just to govern, but to leave no gaps for interpretation. Innovation still happens, but now it happens within a tighter, more pre-calculated framework. The modern rules still bear the fingerprints of Car 7. They are steel reminders of what happens if you go too far. And that brings us to the final whisper, a simple but weighty truth. Some ideas don't disappear. They wait. They wait for technology to catch up. They wait for rulebooks to change. They wait for another mind in another era to look at the same problem and say, what if? And this idea, the idea of challenging not by breaking, but by understanding so deeply it becomes disorienting, that idea is still waiting. At its core, this story was never about winning a car race. If it were, it would have been forgotten long ago, like hundreds of other victories and defeats. This was a challenge, not to a rival on the track, but to the structure the sport depended on. It ended because it asked a question the system could not answer without shaking itself apart. If this is legal, then does the idea of fairness actually exist? The system chose stability. It always does. The car was dismantled. The idea was buried. The man was sidelined, not because it failed, but because it worked. And history did what it always does with uncomfortable truths. It stopped talking about them. So the question remains, quiet, unresolved, and inconvenient. Was Smokey Yunick a criminal or the revolutionary who exposed a system afraid of its own perfection? Decide for yourself. The comment section is open.